Today is Tuesday, July 22nd, 2025, and this is Stephen Fagin, the curator of the sixth floor museum at Dealey Plaza in Dallas. And this interview is part of our oral history project. And at the beginning of these, sir, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves with their name, date and place of birth, and just a little background to get started, please.
Sure. So my name is Alec Nevala-Lee. I was born in Castro Valley, California on May 31st, 1980. So obviously I was not a firsthand witness to the Kennedy assassination, but I recently published a book called Collisions, which is a biography of the physicist Louis W. Alvarez, who was an important figure in the investigation.
Excellent. You are quite a distinguished biographer. How did you get into that line of work?
I was originally a novelist and did a little pivot to nonfiction a few years ago. In part because, I love, the history of ideas. I love exploring interesting questions, and biography is like a really nice way to do that. It gives you a narrative, to like look into, different subjects. And for Alvarez, well, I assume we'll talk about him briefly, in a minute. But his career is like an incredible window into the history of 20th century science. He did all kinds of things. The Kennedy stuff is just one episode in this like incredibly, you know, like diverse, active career. So even though this is what we're going to be focusing on, it's just one interesting thing that I was able to look into and learn about, in the course of writing this book.
Yeah, excellent. I appreciate you sending me a copy of the book, which I have here, Collisions. Um, of course, my familiarity with Dr. Alvarez is through the prism of the Kennedy assassination. And I was actually really surprised just how small those little kind of episodic adventures in Kennedy assassination research were in the span of this remarkable career. For people watching this who are primarily focused on his assassination related work, can you just give us a little background about his life and career and how he came to be the distinguished figure that he did?
Sure. So Alvarez was born in 1911. And for most of his career, he was a physicist at the University of California, Berkeley. So he worked with Ernest Lawrence, at the radiation lab, and then later worked with Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project. So like an incredibly versatile, intelligent, sort of hands-on physicist. Very good at solving problems. Very ingenious and insightful. Um, and the relevant thing about Alvarez is that after World War II, he played a big part in the Manhattan Project. He was actually like the lead scientific observer at Hiroshima, which is pretty incredible. He became like a fairly well-connected scientist, right? This is a period when scientists are being seen as useful advisors, to the government and making policy in ways that weren't true before the war. And Alvarez is kind of at the center of it. Like he understands like the value of having that kind of access. Um, so he does things like advocate for the thermonuclear bomb. He testifies against Oppenheimer at the Oppenheimer hearing, which is a whole other story in itself. Um, but during the time we're talking about here, he is kind of a very ambitious, aggressive individual when it comes to um trying to find ways of influencing policy. And he's also simultaneously conducting incredibly ambitious engineering projects at Berkeley to build the first bubble chamber, hydrogen bubble chamber, which basically it's a particle detector that is this huge machine, to like create a visual record of interactions between subatomic particles. That is this, it's almost like this industrial operation that he is running throughout most of the 50s and early 60s. And so that's kind of the backdrop. Like he is a busy guy. He is clearly um eager to be influential. And I think that's kind of like the emotional, psychological backdrop to kind of how he enters the JFK story.
Mm. He met President Kennedy two times. Can you talk a little bit about those encounters?
Yeah, I mean that's actually very revealing. So the first time he met Kennedy was in '61. He'd actually asked. So after Kennedy's inauguration, he had written to Jerome Wiesner, who was the president's science advisor, saying, "I'm available. I'm a smart guy. I would love to be useful to the administration because he admired Kennedy. He voted for Kennedy, even though he was, politically conservative in some ways. So he ends up working on different committees, and one of them is on Vietnam. So he actually goes to Vietnam for well, it's part of like a larger panel on how science can contribute to limited warfare, conventional warfare, as opposed to just the nuclear side. So, the high point is this trip to Vietnam. He actually goes there with Daniel Ellsberg, who later becomes, famous for leaking the Pentagon Papers. So they read a report on, U.S. involvement in Vietnam, how science might be useful there. And this is pretty early on in the Vietnam story. This is 61 before we've really committed a lot of personnel there. But yeah, so he meets Kennedy briefly in the White House to deliver, some of his thoughts. And famously, Alvarez later claimed that he had misgivings about Vietnam even then, but there was no way he could tell Kennedy what he really thought. That it's very hard to tell the president something that he doesn't want to hear. At least for Alvarez. And so Alvarez said, he would have had trouble saying that he thought that our policies were a disaster, basically. So that's the first time. And the second time is in 63. I think it's in October of 63. He was at a White House ceremony in the Rose Garden uh, for the presentation of the Collier Trophy, which is like a trophy for achievement in aviation. And Alvarez had won this trophy years ago for his work on radar during World War II. And that year, it was actually being given, I believe, to the Mercury astronauts. And so Alvarez is at this ceremony, and he talks to JFK briefly. They have a cordial interaction. And later that year, Kennedy is supposed to give Alvarez a big award, like a National Science Medal, I think. And then the assassination happens. So Alvarez, he was expecting to see Kennedy at least one more time, to receive this honor. But he's killed, and yeah, Alvarez is, I would say, devastated. This is a man he really admired. Um, so like everyone, it was an incredibly traumatic event, but Alvarez had a closer connection to it than a lot of people that ended up investigating the assassination.
Mhm. And he seems kind of a reluctant participant. It doesn't seem like he really wants to get involved in any way with the assassination story, at least for a few years.
Right. Yeah. So he, I mean, he does not take part in the debate until 1966. Um, but when you say he's reluctant, he does not immediately get involved in the investigation or in these questions. But when he does, he dives in. Like he really was after it. I mean, I guess I can go ahead and say what happened is that Life magazine published an article called "A Matter of Reasonable Doubt," which contained the clearest pictures that had ever been published from the Zapruder film. And actually interviewed John Connolly, who said that he felt that after reviewing the evidence that he and Kennedy had been shot by two separate bullets, all right, which is it undermines the Warren Commission's conclusion. If you want to get into more detail, we can, but, Alvarez hears about this issue of Life magazine. His students are talking about it at lunch, and he goes home, and, he's immediately kind of fascinated by the pictures because this is part of his job. Like he is a guy who is really good at interpreting visual information. Like I mentioned, the bubble chamber, which is just it's a machine that generates images, and you're supposed to look at these images that are very hard to analyze and figure out what's going on. And so he basically, despite the fact that he has no formal background in forensic analysis, he says, I'm a smart guy. Again, maybe I'll see something here that no one else can. And this is Life magazine. I mean, this is not a obscure, publication. This is, something that millions of people are going to look at. But Alvarez is like pretty convinced that he can look at these pictures and, like maybe there's information there. Maybe there are things you can infer about, what happened that day from these pictures that haven't occurred to anybody else.
Hmm. And so basically he starts to look at possible reactions that Zapruder may have
Mm-hmm.
had, these kind of almost imperceptible little jiggles of the camera. Can you let's talk
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, so he basically he's like, what can we learn from the images? Okay, and he looks at there are other things he looks at, like how fast was the camera going, how fast was the limousine moving, but the biggest thing that he looks at is what's called like the jiggle effect. The idea is that on the limousine you can see these like dots of white light, and occasionally the dots become lines, and the obvious answer is that at those moments, Zapruder's hand moved the camera. All right, the camera jiggled. Um, so it creates these white streaks, at certain points in the footage. And Alvarez, not the first person to say this, but he thinks to himself, well, what if these are reactions to the gunshots? There's a involuntary muscular reaction when you hear a gunshot. And so maybe the places where the image jitters, you can kind of trace back, figure out how long it would take for Zapruder to react to the sound of the gunshot and kind of figure out when that gunshot happened. So he very carefully takes calipers and measures the streak lengths and plots essentially this jiggle analysis that reveals what look like four jiggles. Okay, and this is interesting because the Warren Commission concludes there were three shots. One of them missed entirely. One was the fatal headshot, and one was the magic bullet. All right, or the single bullet that caused the other wounds. And if you see four jiggles, this is an issue, right? Because you have to say, were there four shots, or is the fourth jiggle, assuming that the jiggle analysis is a valid way of determining the gunshots, what does this fourth jiggle um like represent? And he's not sure, right? But this is actually a really important point. He is conditioned to want to support the Warren Commission's conclusions, right? He is a kind of an insider. He has a lot of friends, in the government, the Rand Corporation, in the kind of in the establishment. The last thing he wants to do is challenge the Warren Commission's findings. And if he were to find evidence that did challenge, that conclusion, it would kind of undermine the whole point of this exercise. So he's very incentivized to find an explanation for that fourth jiggle that is not a gunshot. Should I just keep going? Because this is
Yeah,
a
I want to
revealing.
talk a little bit about the siren. It's
Yes.
because it's quite a stretch, and I think some of this, and this we'll get into this more later with the
Hmm.
acoustics and
Hmm.
the melons and things. There are these moments where, as you say, Alvarez very much seems like he's almost desperate to endorse the
Hmm.
conclusions of the Warren Commission, and I'm curious as his biographer what you think that says about his credibility in some of these different
Hmm.
instances. But we'll
Yeah.
start with the siren.
Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about that. And I'll make it very clear. I don't think he's ever dishonest. I don't think he ever falsified evidence. I don't think he ever, was less than honest about what he found. But he was selective. All right, and maybe he chose to give certain explanations more weight than others based on his desire to support the Warren Commission. Right. So I'll kind of that's like a preface to all this. But he essentially says that he thinks that fourth jiggle was caused by the siren, which was activated at some point um, during the assassination. And he feels that so he knows that most witnesses say the siren was activated after the last gunshot. All right. And he says, well, eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. If we just shift it by 2 seconds and put it kind of in the point in the timeline where this jiggle occurs, it can explain Zapruder's flinch without the need for a fourth gunshot. Right. And that's, at the time, that is his explanation. He says, my um, reading of the evidence suggests that it's the siren and not a gunshot that causes Zapruder to react. The issue that was pointed out to him, and that I think is very clear if you look at the evidence, is that there is really not a lot of dispute about when that siren occurred. Okay, most witnesses said it was after the last gunshot, and we know who activated it. Right, it was a Secret Service agent in the car behind the limo who testified, in volumes of the Warren report that Alvarez had access to, that he activated the siren after the last gunshot. Okay, and I think that's pretty clear. I think Alvarez's suggestion that, oh, if you just move this by 2 seconds, it all makes sense. To me, it's not supportable. I think even he kind of downplayed it later on. But at the time, it was enough for him to kind of say, I found three shots. Let's move on. I think that's what happened.
Hmm. You have this unique position having studied his entire life, and so you have that necessary context. What do you think about his approach to this subject from the very outset?
Yeah. So Alvarez liked being in proximity to power. Okay. He was an ambitious person. He liked being an expert. He liked being asked to serve on committees. And he'd seen what happens to people who challenge, kind of the party line. Oppenheimer was, someone who did say things that were inconvenient to government policy at the time, and he was punished for it. Alvarez was part of that process. So Alvarez knows that if he comes out and challenges, uh, it's not in his interest, right, to challenge these conclusions. Okay, later on we'll talk about the Mellon tests. It takes him years to write up these results because he is kind of concerned about how reliable they are. And he's kind of reluctant because they weren't as conclusive as he wanted them to be. But he knows that if he goes out there saying, "Oh well, I found something that's ambiguous," even, it's not great for his position as a government consultant, as someone who likes being asked to serve on these panels. And I think that that's part of his personality. I think he's someone who had a justifiably high opinion of his intelligence. He was a very smart guy, incredibly, you know, brilliant and insightful and useful. And he liked being recognized for that. And for him, the price of um, you know, challenging and this is not the only time this happens. The price of challenging the consensus on a controversial topic where the government clearly has a vested interest in one particular version of events. He's not going to challenge that. He will either say nothing, or he will um, throw his weight behind one interpretation of events, right? And not in a dishonest way, but in a way that is motivated by other factors besides objective evaluation of the evidence.
Yeah, we saw that with his encounter with Kennedy about Vietnam, and then a
Mhm.
short time later, we see that as in terms of Kennedy's own
Yes, exactly.
death. Tell me a little bit about Paul Hoke. I know Paul. I've been to his house. I think he's a great guy. Tell me a little bit about his relationship to Alvarez.
Yeah, so he was one of Alvarez's students. He was on Alvarez's team in Berkeley. And he's a excellent physicist. But also he's a conspiracy buff, right? He was part of a circle of conspiracy, uh, I guess theorists, you would say, who I think this is not quite this is a little bit later on, but eventually he wrote a newsletter that was very widely circulated and influential, and published a whole book about the assassination. From a point of view, I think that's fundamentally skeptical of the Warren Commission report. And he was Alvarez's, like part of that team, right? So whenever Alvarez is looking into these questions, Paul Hoke is kind of like his, like an intelligent antagonist, right? Someone that Alvarez trusts, intellectually, to say, what am I missing? Like if you were to make a case for a conspiracy based on the physical evidence, what would that case be? And Hoke comes to him and says, well, here are some things that anyone who wants to make a case for a lone gunman has to take into account. And so Hook kind of is like a very interesting supporting player in this whole story because he is involved with a lot of these investigations. But he is, I would say, skeptical as well of what some of Alvarez's conclusions.
Hmm. And Hoke is really the one that kind of inspires what ultimately becomes the Mellon tests.
Yes. Yeah, this is probably the most famous, example of Alvarez, and this is like a few years after the jiggle analysis. So the way I read it, based on the correspondence I've seen, is that in '69, he actually gets a phone call from Clay Shaw's attorneys. So this is the guy that Jim Garrison is prosecuting, for conspiracy in the assassination, and they ask if he can consult essentially for the defense. And he says no, all right, because I think he is concerned that a intelligent skeptic could poke holes in his argument. Things like, that fourth jiggle, all right. He knows that some people could, very plausibly say the siren explanation doesn't make sense. And so he doesn't want to like kind of commit himself in public to that theory again. But it bothers him. I mean, he does not like the idea that he has not resolved this question. All right. And so he actually asked Paul Hoke, like, what is the best evidence for a conspiracy based on the evidence? And Paul Hoke says the head snap. All right. The idea that, JFK's head goes back into the left seems to, at first glance, indicate that the shot came from the front, to the right. So kind of like the grassy knoll area, not the book depository. And this argument is made by Josiah Thompson, all right, who actually had been in touch with Alvarez and had written him a letter before this, pointing out the issue with the siren argument. I think like that letter was one that Alvarez took seriously. I think they made him more reluctant to like do things like work with Clay Shaw's attorneys because he knows that someone like Josiah Thompson could point out the holes in the argument, right? So Paul Hoch gives him a copy of Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, which is, a very intelligent, well-argued book, all right? And Alvarez clearly doesn't agree with the conclusion, but he says he's impressed by the analysis. Like the book has these really good diagrams of the movement of the president's head. And so Alvarez reads the book. He's actually on a plane to like a conference, and he reads the book and says, "Okay, he's right. Thompson's right. This is not just a question of what Alvarez originally thought, that the president just kind of like slumped backwards. It was pushed back by some real force. And the question is, what could have done that aside from a bullet from the front?" And famously, Alvarez works out a solution on like a piece of paper that says that if the momentum that the bullet deposits is less than the momentum created by the jet of brain matter coming out the front, the jet effect of that spray can actually force the head in the direction of the shot. It's kind of counterintuitive, but you can actually envision a scenario where a bullet, like a shot from the back, will actually cause the head to go backward, not forward, based on what's called the jet effect. Okay. And he works out a formula on paper. I've seen like the calculations, and he comes back and he shows it to Hoke and some other folks at the lab. And, they say, well, maybe, but we're not going to be able to convince people unless we actually can demonstrate this experimentally using a reasonable facsimile of a human head. So this leads to these famous Mellon tests. So I mean, feel free to break in if you want me to, clarify anything. But this is in '69. At the end of the year, and I should look up the exact dates in my book if you want. But Alvarez sends one of his associates, a guy named Sharon Buckingham, who's a sort of a gun enthusiast, to the San Leandro rifle range. And Buckingham brings several targets, things to shoot. All right. He brings, I want to say, a coconut, different kinds of melons, a water jug, and he shoots these objects, kind of trying to like replicate the circumstances of the assassination to see what happens. All right. And the short version is that during that first test, it does not go as Alvarez expects. Right. Those targets, they don't come back to the shooter in any kind of unambiguous way, right? Some go off in one direction, some just explode. I mean, it's not a clear cut, demonstration of the jet effect. And the same thing happens when Alvarez goes back with Buckingham. I think the following year, they try again with different kinds of melons. I think jugs of water, balls of gelatin. They're just trying different things. And they find that the jet effect only works with a certain kind of target. All right. It has to be a melon that has been taped in a certain way, so that the bullet can kind of enter cleanly, without a lot of resistance, and then generate like a big blowout, on the other end. So on the third and most famous trip, this is in 1970, Alvarez goes with his family. Paul Hook's there, some other folks, and they shoot the melons that have worked in the past to demonstrate the effect, and it looks great. I think it's like 7 out of 8 melons go back as expected. So that looks really convincing, but only if you ignore or kind of overlook the fact that there's no reason to think that this particular kind of melon will resemble the way a human skull would react, right? Because other things didn't do that. The coconuts, the water jugs, the balls of gelatin, they did not support the jet effect, at least not in the way that Alvarez expected.
Hmm.
So what happens is that Alvarez writes it up, but doesn't publish it because I think he knows that, again, like with the jiggle analysis, there are things about it that you could poke holes in if you were so inclined. And he waits 5 years, right, to publish it. And what happens is that the Zapruder film is shown on TV for the first time, and it leads to a resurgence of interest in the assassination. And then Alvarez kind of like dusts off this analysis, and he publishes a paper where he talks about, the jiggle effect and some other things, he kind of the paper is kind of couched in this interesting way where he's saying, this is not really my definitive view of the assassination. This is like an illustration of how physics can be used to investigate certain problems, right? It's almost like a teaching tool. But clearly he's trying to influence the debate, right? And in the published version of the paper, which is the most famous account of what happened, he does not talk about the first two trips to the rifle range, right? He talks about the third trip that seems really clear cut. And again, he's not necessarily being dishonest here. He's being selective. But I think it's fair to say that if he had reported the results of all three trips to the rifle range, the conclusion would have seemed much less clear. And he knew this. He kind of framed and shaped the argument to kind of make the case that he wanted.
Where was that paper published?
Gosh, that's a good question. I can look it up.
Oh.
Yeah, but it was published in like a teaching journal, right? It was not published in
Mhm.
like a scientific journal like you would expect. It was published in, let's see here. Uh I actually don't have the reference in front of me. Do we to pause and look it up?
Oh, it's fine. I mean, we
Okay.
can we can find it later. I was just curious.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
the point is that it was published in, I would say, an educational journal, like a journal for teachers, all right? And so that kind of helped him frame the, like saying, "Oh, I'm just illustrating an approach to problem solving." Okay, this is like a vivid illustration of how physics can be used to demonstrate something, but clearly that's a rhetorical trick. It's a rhetorical tool he's using to kind of like frame the argument in a certain way.
Let's talk a moment about Tink Thompson, Dr. Josiah Thompson, because I know Tink really well, and I've heard him speak at great length about Alvarez, who even now, as Thompson approaches age 90, is still extremely bitter about his interactions with Alvarez. Was that typical of people who kind of butted heads with Alvarez and disagreed with him?
Yes, no question. Alvarez was, I mean, he was an abrasive person. Okay, this is something that I discovered while reading or researching, this biography. Because if you look at Alvarez's memoirs, he published his own autobiography, like before he died. He seems like a nice guy that people enjoyed working with. But you look at accounts from other writers and his colleagues, his students. He was difficult. He was a hard person to work with, and he could be very very hard on people who he thought, I mean, he expected people to admit their mistakes right away. Um, and if you didn't, he would kind of berate you endlessly until you did. He drove people very hard, around him. And yeah, he was very impatient with anyone who, I would say anyone who disagreed with him because, he enjoys this kind of debate with his peers. I think what's true of Alvarez is that, there could be a mystery, like a problem that is unresolved. He will look at it for a while. He will come to his own conclusion. And if you don't agree with him at that point, he will dig in. Like he will treat, things as if the matter were obvious to anyone. And in fact, for many things that he worked on over the years, the answers weren't obvious, but he always acted as if they were. And so someone who, especially on something like the JFK assassination, anyone who disagreed with him, he would sort of dismiss as like a nut, a crazy, these were his words, for people that raised, in some cases, like Thompson, I think fairly reasonable objections to the things that Alvarez was claiming.
Hmm. But as you mentioned, he read 6 Seconds in Dallas on a plane and was fairly impressed, I think, at least initially, with his approach to this. And yet, in their correspondence, he's so dismissive of Thompson. Do you think he was? I mean, deliberately trying to antagonize him. I'm trying to get into kind of his mindset about why he would do this with somebody whose work he felt was pretty solid.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. I mean, the Thompson writes to Alvarez, I think, for the first time to point out, these issues with his jiggle analysis. Alvarez is not going to be inclined to react to that kind of feedback, especially from someone who he hasn't met, doesn't know, very generously. Um, it's not always true. Like he kept what he called like the nut file in his papers where he was a Nobel laureate. He got a lot of crank letters, and sometimes you read them and he's actually being very polite to the people he's writing to. I was told actually that he was worried that if he brushed off someone, they might become violent or they might come to his house, so he was being like a little bit tactful with some of those people. But yeah, with Thompson, he definitely like pushed back. And I think it's because, Thompson struck a nerve. I think deep down Alvarez knew that these were pretty good critiques. And instead of reacting to them as he might with like a colleague, he just was very dismissive. And I think that's kind of actually very revealing. I think that reflects the fact that Alvarez, and the fact that he later devoted so much time to trying to use Thompson's own diagrams against him. He took it very personally. I think he refers to science as like a contact sport, and I think this is very true in this case.
I want to compliment you because, as somebody who I know a lot about the Kennedy assassination, but I am not a physicist, and I really appreciated the way you put both the jet effect theory and then later the acoustics in layman's terms. I mean, it was probably the clearest explanations of those two things that I've ever come across. So,
Oh, thank you.
congratulations for that.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that means a lot to me. Because I mean, the science in this book is like pretty. Well, I mean, it's full of science, right? The book is, the biography of a guy who lived, in the lab and like lived a life that was sort of steeped in these ideas. And so, yeah, it was very important to me to like be able to convey these things to someone who is not a scientist, who didn't have that background, because I don't have that background. I'm more of a humanities guy myself. And so I really wanted to kind of like figure out how to explain these things in terms that I could understand.
Yeah, I thought it was very accessible. So
Oh, great. Thanks.
great resource for people interested in this aspect of the
Hmm.
assassination, including the broader view of Alvarez's
Hmm.
life and work.
Great.
Let's talk about the acoustics. We're going to jump ahead a few years, and another instance where he's seemingly a little reluctant to get involved. Tell me a little bit about this.
Yeah, so this is the part. This actually was in one of the harder sections to write because it is very complicated, like the story here. So uh 76, I have my notes here. So the House Committee on Assassinations is formed, and it's about to 2 years later, it's about to deliver its report, which initially they were going to support the Warren Commission's findings. But through the conspiracy community, and I forget the details, they are given a audio recording of what is evidently um a microphone that was on one of the motorcycles in Dallas that day. All right. Somehow the transmit button on this motorcycle radio was stuck, and so there are like minutes of uninterrupted audio that were recorded sometime around the assassination. Okay, and we don't know exactly when. Um, and this becomes an important point, but the possibility exists that this recording captured some sounds from the time of the assassination. So it's sent to an acoustics lab for analysis, and the guys come back saying, "We've identified 4 impulse sounds that sound like gunshots." And this is later confirmed by another analysis. And, you know, it's enough for the House committee to essentially throw out years of work. Like the final report says that based on the fact that there seemed to be 4 shots, gunshots on this recording, there have to have been 2 shooters and therefore a conspiracy, right? So this is very controversial, obviously, because again, like these are um, they aren't audible. I mean, this is the thing. Like you listen to that tape, which I've done at least once, and it's just like an engine sound. It's like a very monotonous engine sound, and you have to like look at the actual um whatever to call it, like the data underlying the audio to even see these impulses. It's not like you hear gunshots. There's nothing to hear. So obviously there's the possibility that this is like, like a some random noise that was misidentified as the sound of a gunshot. All right. So in 1980, um, the Justice Department asks, I think it's the National Academy of Sciences, um, to advise on whether the investigation should be reopened based on this acoustics analysis. And Alvarez is approached to run this panel, and he says no because if I am in charge of this panel, the conspiracy buffs will reject the conclusions automatically. So he recommends Norman Ramsey, who's a friend of his, to head the committee, and Alvarez is like a member of it. And he's very critical, obviously, of like the acoustics analysis. He says it's very easy to find, uh, you know, um, correlations between the sound of a gunshot and some random noise, and so he's not persuaded by the acoustics analysis. Um, but of course, obviously, it's hard to disprove. It's hard to say, oh, this is not a gunshot. And so he's always looking for something unambiguous, right? And so what happens is that they actually get a letter from a guy named Steve Barber, who is a rock percussionist, I guess, and is a conspiracy buff, and is at home one night listening to the audio, and he hears something. So he's got like a bootleg. He's got like a bootleg recording of the Dallas police tapes that supposedly show the gunshots. And he listens to actually no, sorry, this is interesting. This is a recording that was released by Gallery Magazine, like a men's magazine. It's like one of those like cardboard record inserts. And so he transfers that to cassette tape, and he's listening to it at home, and he hears something that sounds like the words "hold everything." And what he does have is a bootleg of there's another channel. Again, this is very complicated. I mean, I assume that you're familiar with this story, but I'm trying to keep it straight for listeners that maybe aren't familiar. So there are two channels that were being used by Dallas police that day. There's channel one, which is used by, I would say, regular police operations, and channel two, which is used by motorcycle officers in the motorcade. All right. So two different channels. All right. And he hears a word that sounds like hold everything on channel one. And it sounds familiar. He's heard something like this before. And so he has a bootleg recording of the channel two audio. And he plays that again. And there's a moment where someone says, I think, hold everything secure. I forgot the exact sentence. So basically, it sounds like something from channel two ended up on channel one. Okay. And the explanation, as he sees it, is that this is what's called crosstalk, which means that when you have two channels, and I might get this. This is like, again, we're kind of in the weeds here. If you have someone recording on one channel, it could pick up like audio from the other channel if there's like another radio someplace nearby that happens to be broadcasting on that channel. So it's like background noise that happens to be coming from, that channel one picks up from channel two. The reason this is important is that if the words hold everything occur during the snippet of audio that supposedly has gunshots, they can't be gunshots because the hold everything audio comes from like a minute later. It was recorded. Everyone knows that's like after the shooting happened, right? So if hold everything, if that piece of crosstalk is real, it invalidates the argument that these are gunshots. Do I have that right? Is that essentially
Yeah,
correct?
that's a great explanation of
Okay, thank
the
you. I need to take
controversy.
it.
Yeah.
Take a breath. Okay, this is a lot. So the whole point is that if Steve Barber, this random guy, is correct, then Alvarez and the Ramsey panel don't have to go through this like really elaborate analysis of the acoustics, which is very subjective. You can say this can't be a gunshot because we have crosstalk at the same time from a minute after the assassination, right? So all they have to do is like prove that the crosstalk is real. They have to prove that, and again, it's very subjective. You hear something there that sounds like hold everything, but it could also be noise. It could also be, like just an oral illusion. But Alvarez understands the importance of this claim. He is the one who kind of like looks at the letter and alerts the other members of the panel saying like we should focus on this. Um, and they start to listen to the channel 1 recording. They compare it to the channel 2 recording. Um, what happens, unfortunately, is that there's another piece of crosstalk that seems to be there. All right, and it sounds like the word Cheney, and the Cheney snippet of crosstalk would actually support the argument that this is a recording from the moment of the assassination, because the Cheney audio in channel 2 was around that time. I think that's accurate, right? So basically, just to make things very simple, you have two pieces of possible crosstalk, right? You have hold everything, and you have Cheney. If hold everything is correct, it means that you can throw out the evidence entirely. It's not from the assassination. If it's Cheney, it's still possible that these are gunshots. And so there's a huge incentive for Alvarez to support the hold everything identification and disprove the Cheney identification. All right. And so I think that's probably enough detail, for the purposes of this conversation. People can look at the book if they want to know more. The short version is that Alvarez looks at the audio recordings, he looks at the voice prints essentially. Other members of the panel, look at the same evidence, and they conclude that hold everything is correct, that this is a real piece of crosstalk, and that Cheney is not real. Cheney is just random noise that sounds kind of like the word Cheney, but doesn't hold up when you look at the actual voice prints. So based on that analysis, they say these are not gunshots. Based on the timing, the timeline that is suggested by the hold everything phrase. So I'll pause there. Okay. Is there anything you want to add before I kind of wrap up that discussion?
No,
It is kind of a lot.
yeah, no, you did a great job, and it's another one of those instances. I mean, in each of these, there's just this moment where he has to be a little selective to go with the conclusion that he wants to reach. But in this case, perhaps more so than the others, it seems to be very, very weighted on the evidence. I mean, hold everything secure is by far stronger evidence that the acoustics, the analysis was not of a section of the tape when the assassination happened, as opposed to the
Yes.
Cheney
Yeah.
segment.
Yeah. But I will say two things. One is that if you look at the Ramsey report, they actually release a report on the evidence, and they talk about hold everything, right? This is the centerpiece of their argument, saying that this is not a valid recording of gunshots. But they don't talk about Cheney. Like they actually don't discuss this debate. All right. You have to go back to like the correspondence, and there are like a few references to something in the report that, if you were reading very closely, you could kind of infer that they had looked into some other possible instances of crosstalk, but it's very subtle. It's downplayed in the report, and I think it's this is intentional, because even though they did believe, and I think this is sincere, that the hold everything identification was correct, they don't reveal how hotly debated it was, and they don't reveal that there was another piece of crosstalk that was looked at equally closely, because I think they know that if they acknowledge this, that people will seize on this and try to make the case for the Cheney piece as being correct, which is what happens. Like years later, Hosea Thompson publishes another book, and the whole book is based on the fact that he thinks that Cheney is more convincing than Hold Everything. All right. And I don't have the book with me right now. I don't remember the details, but I think the point is that this stuff is very, I would say it's subjective, but it is every time you make an argument based on this kind of evidence, there's like a counter argument, and it's a real snake pit. I think, as someone who just spent like a fairly modest amount of time looking into it, I kind of realized that, I mean, my conclusion is that unfortunately there is no physical evidence that is unambiguous when it comes to this story. And I think Alvarez never quite was able to reconcile himself to that fact. Like I think he was always looking for like the one thing that would prove the critics wrong.
Mhm.
And I think that was an illusion. I think this is the way he approached problems. But again, like no matter what argument you make, there is someone who's going to come out here with like data that supports the other. interpretation. And I think that's true of this whole debate.
It is interesting the way kind of Alvarez takes the letter from Steve Barber, which who is a musician. He is not a scientist, and he gives that such weight, and it becomes kind of the focal point of that investigation. Whereas, as we discussed, when Tink Thompson, a PhD, is raising these questions, he's very dismissive of him. Even in dealing with some of these assassination researchers, he is selective based upon what that person kind of believes and what theory they're supporting.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. I think, and it's not hard to figure out why. Like Thompson's letter would undermine his case and force him to rethink everything that he had done, whereas the Barber letter gave him this incredible weapon. It gave him this incredible tool where if it was right, it would make his job a lot easier. And so it's not surprising that he would favor one kind of letter over the other.
You start the book with the Kennedy assassination. Why did you make that choice?
That's a good question. Okay, and I've been asked that by more than one person. Whenever you're writing a book like this, you want to like start off with an episode that is revealing and kind of that grabs the reader, I guess. And to me, it's such like a so I started with like Alvarez going to the San Leandro rifle range for the third time with his family and watching those melons. And to me, it's such like a great scene because it conveys so much about Alvarez. Uh, he, it was in the context of his career like a fairly minor episode, but it sort of like it just summed up so much about him, right? The idea that he was this kind of maverick guy who wanted to, take on really flashy, interesting problems. Like he would spend a lot of time looking for problems that his skill set could be used to address, but they had to be interesting. He was not going to waste his time on stuff that was not going to get attention, right? And so this obviously was like an incredibly interesting problem, and he finds this like really kind of ingenious way to demonstrate it, but then also there are complications, right? Like it is not as clear cut, because there's a version of this book that would open with that story and say, look at this guy, he figured this out, this incredible thing, he's what a genius. Which I do think he was a genius, but you look more closely at like his motivations and the omissions, and it complicates that picture. And so that to me, like there was nothing else in the story that encapsulated all that stuff as well as that scene did.
Of those three aspects of the assassination that he delved into, do you personally find one more convincing than another? I'm curious about your personal assessment of this coming into Alvarez's life.
That's a good question. There's no I would say there is not a single unambiguous piece of evidence that I would point to as being convincing. Which is like a funny thing to say after spending so much time on this problem and giving it so much weight in the book. But I mean, I think I said earlier, my conclusion is that Alvarez's tools were not the tools you need to solve this mystery. And that to me is really revealing because he was, if you're going to pick a guy who could figure this stuff out as a scientist, as a physicist, he's the one. He was ingenious and resourceful and well connected and all those things. And I think, to me, the takeaway is more like the limitations of that approach. And unfortunately, I think that the question of, you know, uh, was Oswald the assassin or not is going to end up being based on stuff that is not clear cut, that is inherently slippery, in a way that I think Alvarez found infuriating. The idea is that you have to rely on things like eyewitnesses, whose recollections may be inaccurate, and he wants to sort of circumvent all that, and cut through it. But ends up finding evidence that is equally ambiguous and equally open to interpretation.
Did you in researching the book, did you speak to Hoke and Barber and Thompson?
I did. I spoke to Hoke. I reached out to him in part because he's kind of like a character in a way that the other guys aren't. Like their interactions with Alvarez were confined to letters, which I had. So I didn't feel I had to like, and also it's like I don't know much about C. Barber, but like Thompson has plenty of material already, out there where his thoughts on this matter are not unclear. But no, Hook was great. Hook was an incredible resource. He read the manuscript several times. He critiqued it. He gave me feedback on how to make I mean, he said essentially, when this book is published, you're going to be exposed to, you know, I mean, this hasn't happened yet, but there are people that take this stuff very seriously, as you know, who will look at that stuff very closely. And so he was very careful and very helpful when it came to making sure that, as you were saying, like the science is clear, the statements of, are a factor as accurate as I can make them. And he definitely like saved me from making some mistakes that would have been, you know, problematic if they end up in print.
You've mentioned correspondence and a few other things. Where are the Alvarez papers today?
So they're in the version that I looked at is at UC Berkeley. So I believe that the originals are in the National Archives, but they copied everything, and so like the copies are at Berkeley, and they're probably the easiest to access there. And so yeah, you go there, and there is a massive box, I will say, or several boxes with Kennedy assassination materials. So you go there and you can see, not just like correspondence with people like Thompson, but the memos and the original kind of internal documentation of the Ramsey Panel and other things. So it's a real gold mine. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't put in the book that I think would be of interest mostly to assassination like specialists. But you could write a whole, maybe not a book, but like a whole uh 10,000 word article just on like the Ramsey panel and kind of how they arrived at their conclusion.
Hmm. You think that's in your future?
I think I'm going to take a step back from the Alvarez slash Kennedy stuff for now. If anyone listening to this, wants to take a look, I have those materials, so I'm happy to share them. Because yeah, like it is a very interesting kind of like a narrative there about how like that panel worked and how they like how they made certain choices about what evidence to study.
Hmm. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you feel that we should for this?
Um, I think that we covered it. I mean, I think yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I wanted to kind of underline uh is that um I mentioned earlier that Alvarez had spent the previous, 8 years working on the bubble chamber project at Berkeley. It was a huge uh industrial scale project that required him to manage a big team and uh kind of oversee the work of other physicists. And he didn't like it. Like this was something that he had pitched and gotten funding for and staked everything on, but by the time it was operating, he was not someone who was content just like running a big team. He wanted to be kind of in the like in the field doing research himself. um and so it's around this time he pivots to what I call like scientific detective work. Like he finds interesting problems that he can tackle, even though he's not part of that field. Like if he sees something that he thinks he can contribute to, he will say, again, I'm a smart guy. Maybe I'll see things that these so-called experts can't. And so there's this really interesting pattern where starting around this time, instead of like working on just like the bubble chamber and these like big projects that don't interest him personally anymore, he looks at things like the assassination. He looks into the pyramids. He looks into, famously the extinction of the dinosaurs. These are all things that he can kind of do either alone or in small groups, um, that are exciting to him, that are kind of that reflect his self-image as a scientist more than kind of the administrative operational role that he had otherwise been taking on at Berkeley. So I think that that's kind of the other motivation here. It's that he wanted to kind of get back to the kind of science he was doing when he was a young man, before he had accrued and acquired all these responsibilities and obligations, that were actually kind of pulling him away from that kind of science. He actively sought out these problems, and I think for a lot of reasons, like the JFK assassination was the perfect problem for him to, apply those skills to.
All right, excellent. Well, I do appreciate you connecting with me and talking about this. We're still in the process of building our programming staff. I haven't forgotten about you. I already sent out a note about the book, and I've made it available to other staff members. I'm going to also share this interview as well, because I do think this would be a fascinating, very unique program to have here. So hopefully we'll keep in touch and
Yeah.
maybe be able to arrange something at some point.
I would love that. I mean, I think I had a good time talking to you just now. I think, as you say, might be of interest to folks. So yeah, let's stay in touch and figure out, if that might work.
Excellent, excellent. And of course, if you happen to find yourself coming to the Dallas area, I do hope you'll let me know, because it would be a pleasure, if nothing else, to at least meet you and share the museum with you.
Yes, no question. If that happens, I will let you know.
Excellent. I will probably later this week or early next week send you a link to download a copy of this recording. And yeah, we'll keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, take care.